that team. All right, now we've got the chief racing writer of the Age on the show. We need to talk some racing. Firstly, our final story, which is a bit news-based, and then we might have a look at the weekend ahead. This one comes from Andrew Eddy at racing.com. Having a look at Ben Melham, who will have one of his 7 betting charges dropped, the jockey, after the Victorian Racing Tribunal indicated charge 5 is not a valid charge under the Australian rules of racing. The VRT's chairman, Judge John Bowman, said in his ruling that while he believed the charge for alleged betting on races in another jurisdiction in Singapore was invalid, he would need at least one other tribunal member to sit on the case and make such a ruling. That's likely to happen later in November when the 3-person panel assembles to hear the other 6 charges. But it opens the door, massively for Australian jockeys to bet on international races if this is to be the case, that charge is deemed invalid. Damien, can you take us back through the charges that have been laid against Ben Melham, when we can expect a resolution, and what this ruling yesterday, what that means for Melham and all other jockeys here in Australia?
Yeah, well, I read it the exact same way, that they're going to be, that opens the door for jockeys to bet on international races. The way it played out, the rule is that you can't bet on thoroughbred racing, but Melham's defence argued that the Australian rules of racing only cover Australian thoroughbred racing, and that's the way that it was found this week. Ironically, Judge Bowman, who was the chair of the Racing Appeals and Disciplinary Board, actually penalised another jockey in 2016 for placing a $20 bet on a race at Deauville in France. That jockey had a 3-week suspension and was forced to undergo counselling. And Judge Bowman, in his response yesterday, apologised and said, "I made the wrong mistake." In his defence, the jockey pled guilty, and there was no talk that international racing wasn't covered under the rules. But obviously, in this case, it was challenged, and with a bit of scrutiny, he's determined that that it's free reign. So that does open the door now, I think, for Australian jockeys to bet on international racing, as long as they're not getting any inside information or something like that, which would make it more serious. But this doesn't let Ben Melham off the hook. He still has a number of other charges, including allegedly betting through his partner's account, including races that he was riding in, and that's the most serious of the charges. James McDonald, champion rider in Sydney, copped 2 years for placing a bet on a horse that he rode and won. And if you go back even further than that, Damien Oliver copped a 9-month suspension for betting on another horse to win in the race that he was riding in, and that was sort of the catalyst for trying to stamp this out. So certainly the charges are serious, but Ben Melham's defending all of those charges, and I think they'll be heard just after the Spring Carnival in November. In a bit of clean air due to COVID. The vacancy of the county court has meant that it's been pushed back, but he'll get his chance to defend those charges in November.
Just for clarity, can you just advise Ben Melham, the bet on a race in which he rode, was that on his own mount?
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
And with the jurisdiction not necessarily extending beyond Australia, what ramifications are there then for jockeys who do ride for trainers and owners based in New Zealand, in Japan, obviously the foreign raiders coming over for the Spring Carnival? I mean, could Jamie Carr technically place a bet on Prince of Arran, running on the other side of the world?
Good question, other side of the world. Well, This sort of decision sort of opens up that door, doesn't it? It only happened really last night, so they're questions we probably have to put to Racing Victoria. That they might still have the opportunity to appeal this decision and argue that they don't want jockeys betting in races at all. And it also might see an amendment to the Australian rules of racing, which they can do, where Melham's found innocent at this time, but they put in a new rule going forward that they don't want jockeys betting on races overseas. So, a lot to play out.
They could become like us mug punters and end up at Turfentine late in the evening after a few too many beers. We've got to finish up really quickly, Damien, but before I let you go, it's a huge day of racing on Saturday. 8 of the 10 races on the card at Caulfield are at group level, and 3 big group races at Randwick as well for the 3-year-olds, who are a couple of the main runners to watch.
Well, obviously this weekend we see the Caulfield Guineas and the 1,000 Guineas. These are races that are grand finals for these 3-year-olds. Ole Kirk has relations to Black Caviar. He's the hot favourite in the Caulfield Guineas. He's already a Group 1 winner coming off a win in the Golden Rose, and he's the one to beat. The big query on him is how much rain we get now at Caulfield, because as a 2-year-old he didn't really handle the wet, so that would open up the race. The 1,000 Guineas, Chris Waller has Hungry Heart, who was a disappointing second in the Flight Stakes last week, but as long as she backs up off the 7-day break, she'll be the one to beat. And then, of course, Russian Camelot runs in the Caulfield Stakes. This is a race that isn't necessarily the grand final. It's generally a key lead-up to the Cups and the Cox Plate. He's a $3.50 favourite for the Cox Plate. I think he'll go around about $1.60 on Saturday in the Caulfield Stakes, and if he puts them away, he deserves favouritism. He's not up against the internationals, though, so that's going to add a flavour to the Cox Plate. The internationals arrived last week. They're still doing their quarantine, and they'll be out next Saturday for the Caulfield Cup. So, it's certainly a moving day in racing.
$1.60, better than bank interest, and it's a small Winx-like field. So Russian Camelot, one to watch. Order of the Garter, another one going around on Saturday that plenty will be watching. And you mentioned Hungry Heart. I think the blinker's on for the first time there as well. Yeah. Damien Ractliffe, fantastic to have you on the Best on Ground Weekday Kickoff. Really, really appreciate you giving up your time, and love to have you back on again while the Spring Carnival's still up and running.
Thanks, Peter. Chat soon.
You've been watching and listening to the Best on Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you tomorrow with Jimmy Tucker to preview the Bledisloe Cup. Cheers.